It was an unusually warm September morning when Judge Thomas Bradshaw walked into his courtroom, adjusting his robes with a calm and methodical motion. It was a typical day, or so he thought. The courthouse had an air of sterile orderliness, each step echoing off the polished floors as he entered, his footsteps in sync with the ticking of the large clock on the wall. To him, this was just another day in the grind of the judicial system, judgments, cases, and decisions all blended together in a haze. He took his seat at the elevated bench, looking over the courtroom briefly. His gavel was ready, his mind sharp, but his heart was already a little restless. There was something in the air that morning, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Today, he would preside over a civil violation case involving a woman named Ava Johnson. Judge Bradshaw didn't know much about her beyond her name and the charge she faced, a minor traffic violation for an expired license. He hadn't even looked at her record in detail yet. To him, it was just another small-time offense, something easily handled in the course of his routine. Still, he sensed a sort of quiet confidence from the woman as she entered the courtroom. She wasn't like most people caught in these situations, anxious, defensive, or apologetic. Ava walked into the room with a calm presence that caught the judge's attention. She was tall, well-dressed in a professional outfit, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. The way she stood in front of him told Bradshaw that she wasn't intimidated by this process. In fact, it seemed like this was just another box to check for her, a simple inconvenience in an otherwise well-ordered life. But that didn't matter. The rules were the rules, and the law was the law. In the courtroom, he was the one who wielded the power. Judge Bradshaw motioned for the trial to begin. Ava, her dark eyes meeting his with an unwavering gaze, stood before the bench. Her demeanor was confident but not arrogant. She wasn't being defensive, but her calmness intrigued him. He could feel the slightest tension in her voice as she explained the situation, her words clear but carrying an underlying weight. The situation, according to her, was a simple mistake. Her license had expired without her noticing. Life had gotten in the way. It wasn't an excuse, but she wanted the judge to know that she wasn't trying to evade responsibility. Her voice was steady, but there was something more to her expression, something that suggested this was just a fleeting moment in her larger, more complicated life. Bradshaw didn't buy it. Rules were rules, and it didn't matter whether it was a minor violation or a major crime, the law had to be enforced. He listened intently, his mind already racing through the details. He barely had time to process what she said before he was ready to pass judgment. Ava's explanation wasn't enough to sway him, and he quickly decided that the fine would be hefty. This was a small violation, but one that had to be dealt with firmly. It wasn't just about punishing the individual, it was about maintaining order in the system. Bradshaw had done this 1,000 times. He was the authority here, and she would be held accountable like anyone else. Ava stood silently as the decision was made. There was a brief pause, almost as if she were calculating her next words. She seemed unaffected by the fine, but it wasn't in a defiant way. It was almost as if she was indifferent. Bradshaw couldn't help but feel a small sense of unease. Why wasn't she more upset? Most people in her position would be nervous, apologetic, or begging for leniency. But not Ava. She simply nodded once, acknowledging his ruling without protest. $250 fine. Payable within 30 days. Case dismissed, Bradshaw declared, banging his gavel firmly against the sound block. Ava didn't react immediately. Instead, she simply nodded again and turned to leave. There was no mention of her job, her life outside the courtroom, or anything that would make her seem like the kind of person who would normally be involved in such an incident. It all felt strangely impersonal. Bradshaw couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something important. It wasn't like she was trying to get away with anything, but he couldn't quite understand why she wasn't more vocal about it. In his years on the bench, he had learned to trust his instincts about people. And something about Ava didn't sit right. Not in a bad way, just in a way that left him questioning. As Ava left the courtroom, the case closed and the room quieted, Judge Bradshaw sat back in his chair, looking at the paperwork in front of him. He glanced down at the details of the case again, briefly reading her name, Ava Johnson. He paused, wondering if he had missed anything. But there was no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. Still, something lingered in the air, like a question he couldn't quite answer. With a sigh, he pushed the thought aside. He had other cases to hear. But as the next few hours passed, that feeling never quite went away. The small unease he felt in the courtroom lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. He couldn't quite shake the image of Ava, standing tall and composed, as if this was just another inconvenience to get through. He found himself curious about who she really was, what her life looked like outside of this brief courtroom encounter. There was something about her presence that stuck with him, a quiet force he couldn't ignore. Later that afternoon, after finishing his duties for the day, Bradshaw made his way to his office. As he sat down, the weight of the day started to settle over him. The courtroom had been busy, filled with cases big and small, but there was something unsettling about the way the day had gone. He couldn't help but wonder why Ava had seemed so unfazed by everything. Had he been too harsh? Had he treated her like just another number in a system, without considering the broader context of her life? As he began to work through some papers on his desk, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Without looking up, he muttered, "Come in." To his surprise, it was Ava Johnson standing in the doorway. She was no longer in the professional attire she'd worn earlier. Now, she was dressed casually, but her presence was just as commanding. There was a brief moment of awkward silence. Bradshaw stood, not quite sure how to react. "I wanted to speak with you for a moment," she said, her voice calm but assertive. Bradshaw was taken aback. Why was she here? It wasn't common for someone to return after a ruling. He hadn't expected any further interaction with her. But there she was, standing in front of him, with an air of purpose. "Of course. Please, take a seat," Bradshaw gestured to the chair across from his desk, still unsure of what to expect. Ava sat down, her posture confident as she looked him in the eye. "I know this may seem unusual," she began, "but I felt like you didn't really know who I am, who I really am. I wanted to make sure that you understood the full picture." Bradshaw blinked, surprised by the directness of her words. "I don't understand," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. She smiled faintly. "I'm not just some ordinary person. I'm your supervisor. I'm the one who oversees your position here in the courthouse. I run the department that handles all of the legal administration for this county." She paused, letting that statement sink in. Bradshaw froze. For a split second, his mind couldn't process what she had just said. His supervisor? Impossible. He quickly scanned her face for any sign of a joke, but there was none. She was completely serious. This was not a moment he had prepared for. Judge Thomas Bradshaw's heart skipped a beat, his mind struggling to catch up with the words that had just left Ava Johnson's mouth. He blinked, unable to process the gravity of what she was telling him. His supervisor? The woman he had just fined? The woman who had calmly accepted the fine without protest? It didn't make sense. There must have been some mistake, some kind of misunderstanding. He quickly tried to regroup, but the words echoed in his head like a drumbeat, loud and insistent. "I think there's some kind of mix-up," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though it wavered slightly. "You must be mistaken." Ava didn't flinch. She sat there with an air of quiet authority, as if she had expected this reaction from him. She crossed her arms and leaned back in the chair, studying him intently. Her gaze was unwavering, confident, as though she had already anticipated his disbelief. "No mistake, Judge Bradshaw," she replied calmly, her voice even. "I'm the one who oversees your department, all the legal administration in this courthouse. I've been your supervisor for the last few months. I make the decisions about staffing, case assignments, and even budget allocations. You've probably heard my name, though you may not have connected it with me personally." She let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, as if weighing his reaction. Bradshaw's mind was racing. He couldn't process this. He had been working in the same courthouse for years, knew everyone who worked within the walls, or so he thought. He had never heard her name. He had never seen her before today. How could she be his supervisor? He leaned forward, his hands resting on his desk as he tried to piece together some kind of logical explanation, but his thoughts came in fragmented bursts. "You're telling me that you've been my supervisor all this time?" he asked, his voice incredulous. He couldn't hide the surprise that was seeping through, even as he tried to maintain a sense of control. "But I've never seen you around here. I've never received anything official, any communication about you. How is that possible?" Ava's expression remained calm, unbothered by his flustered reaction. "I work behind the scenes. You don't see me in the courtroom because that's not my role. I handle the logistics, the administration, the policies that keep everything running smoothly. That's why I'm not a fixture in the courtroom. But I'm very much a part of this system, Judge. More than you may have realized." Bradshaw took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He leaned back in his chair, his hands coming up to massage his temples. This was too much to absorb all at once. The woman who had just appeared before him in his courtroom was in charge of his department? His immediate reaction was disbelief. How could that be? The system was organized, with clear hierarchies and structures. How could he have been unaware of someone so crucial to his work? His mind raced through the details of his interactions with the court staff, the clerks, the bailiffs, even the lawyers. There had been no mention of her. None of them had mentioned a person overseeing the department, especially not someone so significant. He had always assumed the administrative side of things was handled by a different branch of government, not someone so intimately connected to the courthouse itself. I don't understand," Bradshaw finally muttered, shaking his head. "Why didn't you make yourself known to me earlier? Why didn't you ever introduce yourself? This is a huge responsibility, and you've been sitting on the sidelines?" Ava gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, as though she were being patient with someone who was still catching up. "It wasn't necessary for me to introduce myself to you," she replied. "I'm not here to make waves or disrupt the way things have always worked. My role is not to step in where I'm not needed. But this is where my role becomes relevant. What you just did in that courtroom? That's something I have to address. It's not about the fine, Judge Bradshaw. It's about your judgment, your perspective, and how you see people. That's what matters here." Bradshaw's stomach turned. He had been caught off guard, but now there was a ripple of unease creeping through him. What was she saying? Was she suggesting that the fine wasn't the real issue? That it was about how he had judged her, how he had treated her in his courtroom? He thought back to that moment when he had made his ruling. He had been so quick, so detached, so sure of himself. He had imposed the fine without hesitation, without any second thoughts. She had seemed so indifferent, so composed, but now it made sense. She hadn't reacted the way most people did because she knew exactly what her place was in this system. And her place was higher than his. He straightened up in his chair, trying to regain his composure. "What do you want from me, then?" he asked, his voice a little strained. "Do you want me to retract my decision? Apologize? Because that's not how this works." Ava shook her head slowly. "No, I don't want you to apologize, Judge Bradshaw. What I want is for you to see what you've done. What I want is for you to recognize that your actions have consequences, especially when you're sitting in a position of authority like you are. You may think it's just a fine, just another case, but it's not. It's about understanding the impact of those decisions. It's about recognizing the people in front of you. Bradshaw's face flushed, the weight of her words sinking in. His mind flashed to the countless cases he had heard, the people he had ruled over, the decisions he had made. He had always prided himself on being fair, objective, and just. But now, in the face of this revelation, he had to confront a new truth. Had he been blind to the very people he was meant to serve? For the next few days, Judge Thomas Bradshaw could hardly focus on anything other than that conversation. His days in the courtroom were a blur, his mind preoccupied with the weight of what had been said. Ava Johnson's words echoed in his mind at all hours. What had she meant by them? Was she right? Had he been so wrapped up in the mechanics of the law that he had failed to see the people he was passing judgment on? It was a hard pill to swallow, one that rattled him deeply. He had always prided himself on being impartial, on following the letter of the law with strict precision. He believed in the system and his role within it. But now, the cracks in that belief were becoming too obvious to ignore. His thoughts were consumed by the idea that he had somehow failed to see his own biases, his blind spots, the ways in which he had treated people differently based on his own assumptions. Ava hadn't even protested the fine. She hadn't argued, hadn't shown anger, hadn't tried to get out of the punishment. She had simply accepted it, like someone who had already learned to navigate the system and understood its rules better than most. But was that really the way it should have gone down? Shouldn't he have seen her as more than just a name on a paper, a face in a courtroom? Had he been too quick to judge her? Too quick to treat her like just another minor offender? His reflection on this question consumed him as the days passed, each new case he presided over making him more aware of how detached he had been from the people he was judging. It wasn't just Ava. It was everyone. The elderly man caught in a dispute with his landlord, the young woman accused of shoplifting to feed her child, the immigrant woman trying to navigate the legal system to get her papers in order. These were not just faceless cases to be decided upon, but people with lives, stories, struggles, and aspirations that deserved to be seen and understood. For years, Bradshaw had placed judgment on them based on the law, but what about their humanity? Had he been so focused on the cold rules of the legal system that he had lost sight of the very reason the system existed in the first place, to serve justice, not just administer penalties? One evening, after the courtroom had emptied, Bradshaw sat alone in his office, his head in his hands. He had been sifting through case files, trying to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Ava. Her calm demeanor, her words that had struck him with the force of a revelation, her authority that he had been too blind to recognize. He replayed the moment when she had walked into his office, explaining who she was, the moment when everything shifted for him. In all his years of service, he had never once questioned the nature of his own authority. But now, suddenly, everything felt different. He wasn't sure if he was just being overly self-conscious, or if there was something real, something deep in his soul that was calling him to re-evaluate his role. It wasn't just the fine he had imposed on Ava that troubled him. It was how he had seen her, how he had seen so many others over the years. How many times had he passed judgment on someone without truly understanding them? How many times had he failed to acknowledge the full weight of their circumstances, their struggles, and their humanity? How many others had walked out of his courtroom feeling as unseen as Ava had felt, despite her calm exterior? The guilt weighed heavily on him. The thought that his actions, even if well-intended, might have caused harm to others in ways he hadn't even realized was overwhelming. He had always believed that being a good judge meant following the rules, upholding the law, and delivering justice. But now, he was beginning to see that perhaps the true essence of justice wasn't just about the law, it was about recognizing the full humanity of the people involved in each case, the complexity of their lives, and the broader context of their situations. Judge Bradshaw's nights were sleepless, and the constant self-reflection left him feeling more isolated than ever before. He couldn't escape the growing realization that his role in the courthouse had been far more about maintaining order than about understanding the people he was supposed to serve. He could feel a shift in the air, a shift in himself. Ava's words had done something to him that he couldn't undo, something that felt like both a burden and a revelation. In a way, he felt a bit lost, like he had to start all over again and rethink everything he had been doing for years. But he couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. He had to face the truth. The truth that maybe he wasn't the impartial judge he had always thought he was. The truth that maybe, just maybe, he had a lot to learn about the human beings behind the cases he dealt with. The next day, as Bradshaw prepared for another day in court, he knew something had to change. He couldn't go back to his old ways, blindly following procedure and delivering verdicts without considering the person in front of him. He had to take a more active role in understanding the individuals who came before him. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be something that could be fixed overnight. But he realized, with a certain clarity, that he had to try. For his own sake. For the sake of those who found themselves at the mercy of his gavel. When the next case came up, Bradshaw took a deep breath before stepping into the courtroom. He had decided to make a conscious effort to engage with the people in front of him, to understand their stories, their backgrounds, and their struggles. He wasn't going to simply impose a fine or a sentence without first acknowledging the full scope of their circumstances. He wasn't going to judge them solely on the legal facts of the case, he was going to make an effort to see them as people. The first case of the day was a young man named Kyle, accused of vandalizing a local store. Kyle was in his early 20s, with shaggy brown hair and a nervous look in his eyes. He stood before Bradshaw, shifting uneasily from foot to foot as he waited for the proceedings to begin. Bradshaw noticed that Kyle wasn't making eye contact, wasn't speaking up for himself. There was a sense of fear and uncertainty about him, as though he didn't truly know what to expect from the system. It was something Bradshaw had seen countless times, but today it felt different. Today, he couldn't just ignore it. "Mr. Henderson," Bradshaw began, his voice calm but firm, "I see that you've been charged with vandalizing a store. Can you tell me what led to this incident?" Kyle swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke. I wasn't thinking straight. I was angry. I had some issues at home, and things just got out of hand." Bradshaw studied him carefully, noticing the way Kyle's hands trembled slightly, the tightness in his posture. It was clear that the young man was dealing with something far more than just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was clear that there was more to this than vandalism. Kyle was carrying something with him, something deeper than just anger. For the first time, Bradshaw felt the impulse to ask the right question. "Tell me more about what's been going on at home, Mr. Henderson," he said, leaning forward slightly. "What are you dealing with?" Kyle hesitated, clearly unsure about opening up. But something about Bradshaw's approach, his willingness to listen, his genuine curiosity, seemed to put him at ease. Slowly, he began to talk, sharing about the struggles he was facing with his family, the pressure he felt from his father, and the financial strain that had been weighing on him for months. As Kyle spoke, Bradshaw realized that his frustration wasn't just about the incident itself, it was about feeling trapped, about feeling invisible and unheard. For the first time in his career, Bradshaw began to understand what it meant to truly hear someone's story, to see them as more than just the sum of their actions. Kyle wasn't just a person who had committed a crime, he was a person who was struggling, who had made a mistake but wasn't beyond redemption. This wasn't just about the law, it was about empathy, about understanding the complexities of human life. Bradshaw took a deep breath, considering Kyle's situation. He could feel the weight of the decision in front of him, but he knew that today, he had a chance to make a difference. Instead of simply handing down a sentence, he decided to take a different approach. He would order community service, but also make provisions for Kyle to receive counseling, to help him address the deeper issues that had led him to this point. It wasn't the traditional route, but Bradshaw knew it was the right one. He had made a decision that went beyond punishment. It was about understanding and providing a path forward. As the hearing came to a close and Kyle left the courtroom, Bradshaw felt something shift inside of him. It wasn't a big change, but it was a start. He had listened, really listened, and that made all the difference. He wasn't sure how things would unfold, but he knew that his approach had changed. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing more than just handing out rulings. He was reaching people, seeing them for who they were, not just what they had done. It was a small victory, but it was one that had a profound impact on him. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, Judge Bradshaw felt like he was on the right path. The following weeks proved to be a turning point for Judge Bradshaw. The shift in his perspective didn't happen all at once, but gradually, the new way of thinking began to shape his approach to every case, every person who walked into his courtroom. The more he listened, the more he realized that true justice wasn't a one-size-fits-all concept. It wasn't simply about applying the law to the letter. It was about applying it with understanding, compassion, and a recognition that each case was part of a larger, more complex narrative that went beyond what could be written in the court papers. He began to feel a deep sense of responsibility, not just to uphold the law, but to understand the lives of the people it affected. Ava's words had cut deep, but they had also planted a seed in him, one that he couldn't ignore. He thought back often to their conversation and the way she had so calmly but firmly called him out for his failure to see the full picture. The more he reflected, the more he realized how much truth there was in what she had said. And as time passed, it became clear to him that he had to take a long, hard look at himself, at his own biases, his assumptions, and how those things had shaped the decisions he made. One afternoon, a case came before him that would challenge him even more than he expected. It was a relatively routine case. An elderly woman, Mrs. Doris Walker, had been accused of stealing from a local grocery store. She was in her 70s, her hair a patchy gray, her eyes tired and filled with a quiet desperation. Bradshaw immediately noticed that there was something different about this case. Something about Mrs. Walker didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the crime that caught his attention, it was her. She appeared fragile, hunched over with age, and her face showed the wear of a long life filled with hardship. He had seen her type before, the kind of person who might have found themselves in trouble through desperation or misunderstanding. When Mrs. Walker entered the courtroom, her gait slow and shaky, she looked around at the empty benches and then at the judge, her eyes filled with anxiety. She stood there as if she were out of place in the formal setting, as though she didn't belong here. Bradshaw's heart tightened as he watched her fumble to present her defense, her words barely audible as she explained that she hadn't meant to steal the items. She was just trying to pick up a few things for dinner, and the small groceries had slipped into her purse without her realizing it. Bradshaw could feel his old instincts kicking in, the instinct to punish, to apply the law strictly. But something about Mrs. Walker's situation didn't fit with the standard procedures. He saw the helplessness in her face, the quiet shame that seemed to consume her. She wasn't a criminal, she was an old woman who had made a mistake. He could see that now, in a way he hadn't before. His heart softened as he listened to her story, and the weight of the moment became clear to him. This wasn't about a petty theft. It was about a woman struggling to make ends meet in her later years, about the frailty of aging and the fear that comes with it. For a long moment, Bradshaw sat there, contemplating the next steps. He could have easily imposed a fine, a sentence, or some other form of punishment. But as he looked at Mrs. Walker, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case required something different. It was about recognizing the humanity of the person before him, not simply punishing them for their actions. Mrs. Walker wasn't a threat to society. She wasn't a hardened criminal. She was someone who had likely never been in trouble before, someone who had spent decades of her life abiding by the rules, but had stumbled because of the weight of her circumstances. As he thought about how to proceed, Judge Bradshaw's thoughts turned to the many cases he had presided over in the past, all the times when he had simply followed the letter of the law without truly considering the human side of things. He had delivered his verdicts with detachment, without ever fully understanding the people whose lives he was affecting. But now, after everything he had learned, he knew that he couldn't do that anymore. It wasn't enough to simply apply the law, he had to understand the people who came before him, the stories behind their actions. The decision Bradshaw made in that moment was one that surprised even him. He called Mrs. Walker forward and, with a calm yet firm voice, addressed her directly. "Mrs. Walker, after hearing your testimony and considering the circumstances of your case, I've decided to take a different approach. I'm not going to fine you, and I'm not going to impose a jail sentence. Instead, I'm going to offer you an opportunity to make things right in a way that can help you, not punish you. I'm ordering you to take part in a community service program that focuses on helping others in need. I believe that you can use your experience to give back to the community, to help those who are struggling as you are. And, should you need assistance with your living expenses or other challenges, I'll make sure that you're connected with the proper services to help you get back on your feet." The courtroom was silent for a long moment as Mrs. Walker processed his words. Her eyes filled with tears, and she placed a trembling hand to her mouth, as though she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Thank you, Judge Bradshaw," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant to cause trouble. I was just trying to make it through another day." Bradshaw nodded, his voice steady as he spoke. "I understand, Mrs. Walker. And I believe you. I hope this decision helps you find some peace, and I hope that it provides you with the support you need. Don't think of this as punishment, think of it as an opportunity to rebuild, to help others, and to regain a sense of dignity." As she left the courtroom, Bradshaw watched her slowly make her way out the door, her back straighter now, a small sense of relief in her step. He sat in his chair for a long time, contemplating the decision he had just made. It was a decision that went against his old instincts, a decision that focused not on retribution, but on healing, on understanding, and on compassion. It was a decision that embodied the kind of justice he was beginning to believe in, justice that recognized the full humanity of the person in front of him, that looked beyond the crime to understand the reasons behind it. That evening, as Bradshaw sat at his desk, reviewing his calendar for the coming weeks, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't a peace that came from thinking he had all the answers, or from believing that he was perfect in his newfound approach. But it was a peace that came from knowing he was finally heading in the right direction. He was starting to see people for who they truly were, not just as cases or offenses to be dealt with. He was beginning to understand the deeper complexities of justice, and how important it was to apply the law with both compassion and wisdom. In the days that followed, Bradshaw received a few more cases that tested his resolve. Some were easier than others, but each time, he made an effort to see the person behind the case. He asked questions, listened carefully, and considered the circumstances before rendering a decision. There were still moments of doubt, moments when his old habits tried to resurface, but he fought against them, reminding himself that this new approach was what justice truly demanded. As he stood in his office late one evening, his eyes falling on the case file in front of him, Bradshaw felt a sense of gratitude toward Ava. Her words had been the catalyst for a transformation that had shaken him to his core. He had spent his entire career believing that justice was a rigid thing, a set of rules to be followed without question. But now, he understood that true justice wasn't about rules alone. It was about people, about seeing them, hearing them, and understanding their stories. It was about recognizing the humanity in every individual who came through his courtroom. And though the road ahead would be long, Bradshaw knew he was finally on the right path. As the months went by, Judge Bradshaw's transformation continued. He felt as though his perspective on the world, on justice, and on human nature had shifted permanently. He no longer saw himself merely as a gatekeeper of the law, but as someone responsible for ensuring that the law worked for people, for human beings with real lives, struggles, and challenges. His time in the courtroom became not just about enforcing the rules but about shaping the outcomes in ways that could foster understanding and rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. His colleagues had begun to notice the change as well. At first, they were cautious, unsure of how to respond to his new approach. The legal system was built on precedent, on the expectation that judgments would be consistent and reliable, and Bradshaw's willingness to look at each case through a lens of empathy and individual circumstance was seen as unconventional. In meetings, some of his fellow judges raised eyebrows when he suggested diversion programs or restorative justice practices, programs aimed at rehabilitation rather than retribution. They weren't sure if it was his own personal crisis of conscience or something that could lead to actual changes in the way they approached cases. But over time, Bradshaw's results began to speak for themselves. Cases were no longer cut and dry, they were nuanced, filled with layers that could no longer be ignored. For instance, in a recent case involving a young man, Jamal, who had been caught selling drugs on the street corner, Bradshaw didn't simply sentence him to prison. Instead, he inquired about Jamal's background, listened to the young man's story, and learned that he had been raised in a neighborhood where crime was the only way to survive. His mother had been ill for most of his life, and his father had been incarcerated for the better part of a decade. Jamal had dropped out of school early to care for her. His life, it seemed, had always been shaped by forces beyond his control. Bradshaw made the decision to offer Jamal a chance at rehabilitation through a community outreach program that focused on job training, mentoring, and education. The program was designed to help young men like Jamal build skills that could lead to real, legitimate employment, something that would give them a way out of the cycle of poverty and crime that had trapped them for years. When Jamal walked out of the courtroom with a renewed sense of hope, Bradshaw felt a deep sense of accomplishment. This was not a person who deserved to be locked away. He was someone who had made mistakes, yes, but he was also someone who had the potential to change his life. It was a decision that Bradshaw knew could change the course of Jamal's future, but it also reaffirmed the judge's belief that justice wasn't about punishing people for the sake of punishment. It was about giving them an opportunity to rise above their circumstances and make better choices. But while Bradshaw's newfound approach was beginning to have a profound impact on his work, it was not without its challenges. He found that it often put him at odds with his colleagues, particularly the more traditional judges who still held tightly to the belief that the law should be applied strictly, without exception. They would often question his decisions, debating whether he was too lenient, too soft in his rulings. And yet, Bradshaw found comfort in the small victories, in the quiet nods of approval from those whose lives he had touched. It wasn't always easy to defend his methods, but the results spoke for themselves. One of the more difficult moments came when Bradshaw faced a case that threatened to test his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. A young woman named Claire, a college student, was brought before him on charges of embezzlement. She had stolen a significant sum of money from a local charity organization she worked for as an intern. The facts of the case were clear, there was no dispute over her guilt. But as Bradshaw sat in his chambers, reviewing the case file, he couldn't help but wonder, what led Claire to commit such a crime? The daughter of a well-off family, Claire seemed to have everything going for her on the surface. But as Bradshaw dug deeper into her background, he learned that her family was going through a tumultuous period. Her parents were going through a bitter divorce, and the emotional toll it had taken on Claire was evident in her behavior. She had been struggling to keep up with her studies, feeling increasingly isolated from her peers, and dealing with pressure to live up to the expectations set by her family. The charity job had been a lifeline for her, something that had allowed her to feel independent and capable. But when she found herself in debt, facing mounting bills and the pressure of a future that seemed uncertain, she took the money. It was a desperate act, born out of fear and a sense of hopelessness. When Claire stood before him in the courtroom, Bradshaw could see the remorse in her eyes. She wasn't a hardened criminal. She was a young woman who had made a poor decision under immense stress. Bradshaw felt the weight of her case more deeply than he had anticipated. She wasn't the kind of person who deserved to be branded as a criminal for the rest of her life. She needed help, not just punishment. After listening to Claire's testimony, Bradshaw made a decision that once again took his colleagues by surprise. Rather than impose a jail sentence or a hefty fine, he ordered Claire to undergo therapy for emotional and financial counseling. She would also have to pay restitution to the charity, but he allowed her to work out a payment plan that was more manageable given her circumstances. He also suggested that she volunteer with a financial literacy program to help others who found themselves in similar situations. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some of his colleagues questioned the leniency of his ruling, arguing that Claire's actions were too serious to simply brush aside. But Bradshaw knew that this was a moment to demonstrate the kind of justice he now believed in, justice that considered the whole person, the story behind the crime, and the potential for redemption. He wasn't excusing Claire's actions, he was acknowledging the complexities of her life and the possibility of her transformation. In the end, it was a ruling that allowed Claire to get back on track, to learn from her mistakes and build a better future. It was a decision that could have a far greater impact on her life than any prison sentence ever could. As Bradshaw's reputation as a judge who sought to understand and rehabilitate those who came before him grew, so did the challenges. His approach was still controversial in many circles. There were those who believed that the law should be an unbending force, that any deviation from the standard punishment was a sign of weakness. But Bradshaw was not deterred. With each case, he felt more confident in his approach, more certain that the path he had chosen was the right one. There were moments, of course, when he doubted himself. Moments when he questioned whether he was being too lenient, whether his decisions were truly helping people or simply delaying the consequences of their actions. But he quickly learned that this wasn't about being lenient or tough, it was about being just. It was about seeing people as more than their mistakes, as more than the sum of their offenses. Everyone, no matter their crime, had the potential for change. And it was Bradshaw's job to help them find that path, not to lock them away and throw away the key. As the months passed, he began to see the results of his decisions. Jamal, the young man he had sent to the community outreach program, had started working at a local construction company and was attending classes to earn his GED. Mrs. Walker, the elderly woman who had stolen groceries, was now volunteering at a food bank, helping others in need, and had started receiving assistance for her medical expenses. Claire, the college student who had embezzled from the charity, had paid off the restitution and had gone on to earn a job in the nonprofit sector, using her experience to help others avoid making the same mistake. It wasn't always easy to see the direct impact of his decisions, but Bradshaw knew that he had made the right choice. He had changed the way he approached the law, and in doing so, he had changed the lives of the people who had come before him. Each victory, no matter how small, reaffirmed his belief that true justice was not just about following the law. It was about seeing the whole person, understanding their circumstances, and offering them the chance to make things right. It was about empathy, about looking at the world through someone else's eyes, and recognizing that everyone had the potential for change. Bradshaw's journey wasn't over. There would always be cases that tested his resolve, that forced him to question his methods and his decisions. But for the first time in his career, he felt that he was finally doing the work he was meant to do, not just as a judge, but as a human being trying to make the world a better place, one decision at a time. He knew that he would never stop learning, never stop growing, and never stop seeking justice, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the hearts of the people he served. Months passed, and the stories of the people Bradshaw had helped continue to shape his work. He became known, not just in his courthouse, but across the city as the judge who saw people, not cases. His courtroom, once cold and rigid, transformed into a space where people were heard, where the nuances of their lives were considered, and where the law was applied with empathy, not just with authority. The cases that came before him now felt like opportunities to make a real difference. Each time he delivered a judgment, he knew that it wasn't just a verdict, it was a step in the healing process for everyone involved. Yet, despite the progress he had made, there were still moments of doubt that crept into his mind. Could he really make a difference in the long run? Was it enough to be kind when the world seemed so harsh, so unyielding? One of those moments came when a new case landed on his desk, one that would test the very foundation of his new approach to justice. A young man named Ethan, in his early 20s, had been caught driving under the influence, causing a serious accident that left another man critically injured. The facts were grim. Ethan's blood alcohol level was well over the legal limit, and witnesses reported that he had been driving erratically before swerving into oncoming traffic. The victim, a middle-aged man named Roger, had been a beloved teacher at the local high school, a man whose family and students described him as kind, dedicated, and deeply loved. Ethan's actions had led to a tragedy, and the law demanded that he face consequences. Bradshaw knew the law, and he understood the weight of the situation. He wasn't naive enough to think that Ethan should simply walk away without facing repercussions. But what disturbed him, as he reviewed the case, was the overwhelming sense of fear and regret that radiated from Ethan's file. The young man had no prior criminal record. He had no history of substance abuse. He wasn't a hardened criminal. Instead, he was someone who had made an unthinkable mistake, a mistake that had cost another person dearly. What was most disturbing to Bradshaw was the information he found when he looked into Ethan's background. Ethan came from a family torn apart by addiction. His father, a once promising lawyer, had fallen victim to alcoholism and had lost everything: his job, his marriage, his dignity. Ethan had watched his father's decline throughout his childhood, and despite his attempts to distance himself from that legacy, he had never fully escaped the shadow of addiction. He had struggled with it in his own way, going through phases of binge drinking as a means of coping with the pressure of his life. The night of the accident had been one of those nights. Ethan had been at a party, surrounded by friends, feeling the weight of his failures, of his family's brokenness. When the alcohol took over, he lost control. When Ethan appeared before Bradshaw in court, his face was a mask of shame. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, his body hunched, his hands trembling as he stood there, waiting for the inevitable consequences. The victim's family was in the courtroom as well, their faces twisted with grief and anger. Bradshaw could feel the weight of the emotions in the room. He could sense the pain that was so raw, so real, from the victim's family, but he could also feel the torment in Ethan. This was not a hardened criminal. This was a man who was deeply broken, a man who needed help as much as punishment. As the trial progressed, Bradshaw listened to both sides carefully. The victim's family spoke about their loss, their devastation. They talked about how Roger's death had impacted their lives, how their world had been shattered by one moment of recklessness. They had lost a husband, a father, a teacher. Bradshaw could hear the grief in their voices, and he could see the depth of their pain. But as Ethan's lawyer spoke, as the young man gave his testimony, Bradshaw heard something else. Ethan spoke of regret, of wishing he could take it all back, of knowing that he had destroyed someone else's life because of his own inability to deal with his demons. His voice cracked with emotion, his shoulders shaking as he apologized to the victim's family, but there was no redemption in his eyes, only the crushing weight of what he had done. As Bradshaw sat there, listening to Ethan's words, he was faced with an impossible decision. The law said that Ethan should face serious consequences, jail time, fines, and a possible criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. But Bradshaw knew that simply imposing the law wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't heal the wounds that had been created that night. It wouldn't undo the pain. It wouldn't fix what was broken. Bradshaw made the difficult decision to adjourn the case for a week. He needed time. Time to think. Time to reflect on everything he had learned in the months since he had first begun to rethink his approach to justice. He spent that week in deep contemplation, poring over Ethan's case, his background, his life. He spoke to counselors, to people who had worked with those struggling with addiction. He spent hours considering the nuances of the situation, the people involved, the tragedy that had unfolded. In the end, Bradshaw came to a conclusion that would once again put him at odds with many of his colleagues. He ruled that Ethan should be given the chance to prove himself, but that he would need to earn it. Bradshaw sentenced Ethan to a rehabilitation program, one that focused on addiction recovery, emotional healing, and accountability. But that wasn't all. Ethan would also be required to work in the community, helping to raise awareness about the dangers of drunk driving. He would spend time volunteering at a local shelter, helping people who were dealing with their own struggles. But the real twist in Bradshaw's ruling was this: if Ethan completed the program and showed genuine remorse, he would be allowed to avoid jail time entirely. He would receive a chance to rebuild his life, to make amends, to show that he could take responsibility for his actions. The victim's family was furious. They felt betrayed by the ruling, angry that the man who had killed their loved one would be allowed to walk free while they continued to suffer. They had wanted justice, real justice, and they saw Bradshaw's decision as a betrayal of that. Bradshaw knew the decision wouldn't be popular. He knew it would cause outrage. But he also knew that true justice was not about vengeance, it was about healing, understanding, and the possibility of redemption. Ethan's journey was not easy. The rehabilitation program was grueling, and at times, it felt like an impossible task. He faced his addiction head-on, confronted the demons that had haunted him for years, and slowly began to rebuild his life. He worked tirelessly, not only on his recovery but on making amends. He met with Roger's family, though the road was difficult, and though they still could not fully forgive him, they saw in him the effort, the desire to change. Months later, when Ethan stood before Bradshaw at the final hearing, he was a different person. His posture was straighter, his eyes clear, his voice steady. He spoke to the court, to the victim's family, and to Bradshaw, expressing his deep remorse and gratitude for the second chance he had been given. He had completed the program, had stayed sober, and had become an advocate for change. It wasn't perfect, and it would never undo what he had done, but it was a start. In the end, Bradshaw did something that few judges would ever do. He closed the case with a quiet acknowledgement that justice had been served, not through punishment alone, but through a commitment to healing, to growth, and to accountability. He wasn't offering Ethan a free pass, he was offering him a path to redemption. As the courtroom emptied, Bradshaw sat alone at his desk, reflecting on the weight of the decision. He had made choices that were not always popular, but they had felt right. He had learned that justice was not a simple equation, it was a complex, ever-changing process that required both strength and compassion. In that moment, he knew that he was on the path he had always been meant to walk, even if it wasn't the easiest or the most conventional one. Bradshaw wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a mentor, a guide, a steward of the law and of people's lives. And that, he realized, was the true meaning of justice.